One summer afternoon, Charlotte sat on her porch, overlooking the Atlantic, a warm cup of chamomile tea in her hand. The breeze smelled like salt and memory. She stared at the horizon, lost in thought, as a wave of realization hit her. She had spent too much of her life wishing for things instead of living them. I wish I had traveled more when I was younger. I wish I had started my art studio. I wish I hadn't wasted so much time worrying what others thought of me, she whispered. It wasn't the first time those thoughts surfaced. But something was different now. Maybe it was the stillness of the ocean. Maybe it was the ache in her knees that reminded her time wasn't infinite. But Charlotte finally saw how much of her energy had been spent in regret, in longing for a version of her life that never existed. That moment became a turning point. She stood up, walked inside, and took out a dusty notebook from her kitchen drawer. It was the same journal she'd kept during her teaching years, filled with lesson plans, dreams, and unused ideas. She flipped to a blank page and wrote in large, shaky letters, "Stop wishing, start doing." The first mistake she vowed to stop making was wishing her life away. She realized how often people, especially women over 60, get caught in the trap of what could have been. But those thoughts rob the present of its power. Charlotte knew that each day was a gift, and the habit of always wishing for something else was the thief of joy. The second mistake was one she recognized too well, making promises she couldn't keep. As a natural nurturer, she had always said yes to people, yes to helping with errands, yes to watching her neighbor's dog for a week, yes to hosting family dinners she didn't have the energy for. These promises came from a good heart, but they often left her exhausted, and, at times, quietly resentful. No more empty yeses, she said aloud. From now on, she would only agree to what she could truly give. Her time, her energy, her love. They were valuable. And she would no longer hand them out of guilt or pressure. And then came the third, hiding her love. For years, Charlotte had assumed her grown children knew how much she adored them. She cooked for them, helped raise their children, sent birthday cards and gifts. But she rarely said it. She rarely looked them in the eyes and simply said, "I love you." That week, she did. She called each one. Her son in Colorado, her daughter in Vermont, and even her estranged sister in Oregon. And with each call, her voice cracked. But her heart felt lighter. No one should go another day without knowing they are loved. That porch, that ocean, that quiet afternoon. It was the moment Charlotte decided to stop waiting and start living. And with that choice, her life began to shift in the most beautiful ways. Just 2 weeks after Charlotte's turning point on the porch, something unexpected happened, something that would test everything she had just decided for herself. It was a Friday morning. The sky was a heavy gray, and the storm winds were beginning to churn over the bay. Charlotte was in the kitchen, humming as she prepped ingredients for a small soup she was planning to bring to her neighbor, Grace, who had recently undergone knee surgery. Then the phone rang. "Charlotte," a deep voice said. "This is Dr. Miller's office. We're calling about your last test results. The doctor would like to see you in person today. Can you come in this afternoon?" Her stomach dropped. She had gone in a week ago for a routine checkup. There had been some fatigue, maybe a little unexplained weight loss, but she chalked it up to age and stress. Still, that tone, the one every patient knows too well, froze her in place. At the clinic, Dr. Miller didn't waste time. "There's a mass," he said gently. "It could be nothing, but we want to be sure. I've scheduled a biopsy for Monday." Charlotte left the office stunned. The wind had picked up outside, and as she stepped into her car, tears pooled behind her glasses. All of the newfound peace she'd built over the past few weeks now felt fragile, like sea glass crumbling beneath her fingers. That night, she sat with her journal again. But instead of writing down dreams, she wrote down fears. What if it's cancer? What if I waited too long to start truly living? What if this is the end of my new beginning? But just as the storm outside began to rage, something inside her sparked. A fire she hadn't felt in years. She remembered the lesson she'd just learned. Don't wish your life away. And so, Charlotte made a new promise to herself. I will not waste another second in fear. If this is the beginning of something hard, I will face it with open arms and an open heart. But I will not stop living. The next morning, instead of canceling plans, she bundled herself in her navy raincoat and took that soup over to Grace's house. They sat together, watching the wind whip through the pine trees, talking not about sickness, but about possibility. The trip to Nova Scotia they both still dreamed of, the poetry Charlotte had once written but never shared. By facing the unknown head-on, Charlotte felt a strange sense of peace return. The biopsy might come back with answers she didn't want. But the way she would live from now on, regardless of the outcome, was entirely in her hands. The unexpected storm, both outside and within, didn't break her. It awakened her. The waiting was the hardest part. For nearly a week, Charlotte wandered through her days in a fog, trying to stay busy while her mind played out every scenario. The biopsy results were coming. Every phone ring made her heart lurch, and yet, something had changed in her. Before her turning point, she might have spent these days spiraling, consumed by fear, regret, and worst-case thinking. But now, Charlotte approached each moment differently. She wasn't just passing the time. She was choosing how to live within it. She began walking along the cliffs near her cottage each morning. The wind was often sharp, and the waves thundered against the rocks. But those elements grounded her. One morning, as she stood at the edge of a steep overlook, she whispered, "Whatever comes, I'm still here." That whisper became a mantra. And then the call came. "It's benign," Deirdre Miller said. "Completely benign. We'll monitor it, but there's no need for alarm." Charlotte thanked him, but when she hung up, she didn't cry. She didn't jump for joy either. Instead, she sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, hands resting on her lap, and whispered again, "I'm still here. And now, I know what that means." The scare had done something to her that no motivational quote or well-meaning advice ever could. It had clarified her priorities with brutal precision. It had shown her that life doesn't offer guarantees. And that truth made everything more sacred. She no longer cared about the petty arguments she once replayed in her head. The bitterness she held toward a former friend melted away. She sent that friend a card the next day with a simple note, "I hope life is being kind to you. I'm sending love from afar." She also stopped criticizing herself so harshly. The wrinkles around her eyes, she no longer saw them as imperfections, but as the legacy of laughter and years fully lived. The 10 extra pounds. They were just part of the story her body told. Of meals shared, birthdays celebrated, comfort found. One of the most powerful shifts came with how she viewed her past. The regrets she'd once clung to, like not pursuing a singing career in her youth, lost their sting. "I may not have stood on Broadway," she said to her reflection, "but I've built a life filled with quiet songs, whispered stories, and beautiful chapters." Charlotte's perspective had transformed from scarcity to abundance, from fear to trust. She no longer saw aging as a slow fading away, but as a conscious unfolding of who she truly was. And perhaps the most beautiful part, she no longer waited for permission to embrace joy. Whether it was buying herself fresh flowers from the Saturday market, or sending a spontaneous text to her grandson, just to say "I am proud of you." She began to live every day like it mattered. Because now, she knew, it absolutely did. One breezy afternoon, Charlotte found herself standing in front of the old community center in town. The paint was chipped, the windows dusty, but inside, laughter echoed, soft but warm. A small sign near the door read "Thursday Writers' Circle, all ages welcome." She hesitated. For years, she'd scribbled poems in journals, short stories on napkins, and thoughts in the margins of cookbooks. But she had never shared them. Fear of being too old or not good enough had kept her silent. But now, after her recent scare and the clarity it had brought, she didn't want to hide anymore. Charlotte took a breath, adjusted her scarf, and walked in. 6 people sat in a circle, some in their 20s, one woman in her 40s, and a man with white hair and a mischievous smile, who reminded her of a younger version of her late brother. They welcomed her with warmth, offering tea and a printed packet of writing prompts. For the first half hour, Charlotte just listened. Then the group leader, a kind-eyed woman named Zoe, turned to her and asked, "Would you like to read something?" No pressure, of course. Charlotte's heart pounded. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a poem she had written the week before, inspired by her walks along the cliff. I stood at the edge of the world, not asking for answers, only the sound of the wind to remind me I was still breathing. As she read, her voice trembled, but when she finished, the room was quiet, and then someone clapped. Then another, and then a voice said softly, "That was beautiful." In that moment, a door opened. It wasn't just about poetry. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she'd buried beneath decades of responsibility, worry, and self-doubt. That Thursday afternoon became the first of many. Week after week, she returned, bringing more of her words, more of her truth. She started to believe in her own voice again. Word spread. Soon, Zoe invited her to read at a local open mic. At first, Charlotte declined, but then she remembered her promises. Stop wishing. Start doing. So, the next month, under soft stage lights at the town bookstore, Charlotte stepped up and shared her words with a room full of strangers. And when she finished, they stood. They clapped. Some even cried. But more than their applause, what filled her with joy was this realization: her life wasn't winding down. It was blooming in a new direction. She had found a community, a passion, and a platform for her voice. Not because she chased after it, but because she allowed herself to say yes when opportunity knocked. Charlotte had stepped into a chapter she never imagined, and it was glorious. Over the next few months, something remarkable began to happen. Not just in Charlotte's life, but in the lives of those around her. Her quiet confidence had become magnetic. She hadn't set out to inspire anyone. She didn't see herself as wise or brave, but through her small acts, joining the writer's circle, reading her poetry aloud, opening up about her fears and hopes, Charlotte had become a beacon of possibility for others who thought it was too late to begin again. At the local farmer's market, a woman in her 70s named Marian approached her. "I heard you read at the bookstore," she said. "I used to paint. I haven't picked up a brush in 20 years, but after hearing you, I dug out my old supplies." Charlotte's eyes welled up. It was working. Her decision to live fully, unapologetically, was giving others permission to do the same. She began to mentor a few younger women in the writers' group, not by teaching. She never claimed to be an expert, but by listening deeply, encouraging gently, and reminding them that their voices mattered at every age. Her days, once filled with quiet isolation, now danced with purpose. Mornings were for walks by the sea or journaling with a hot cup of tea. Afternoons brought visits from friends, writing sessions, and even Zoom calls with her grandson where they traded short stories. His about outer space, hers about old oak trees and secret gardens. Charlotte also started to let go of perfection. She didn't try to look younger or pretend to have it all together. She embraced her silver hair, wore bright colors that matched her joyful spirit, and stopped apologizing for taking up space in a world that too often ignores older voices. The once shy widow who whispered affirmations to herself on a stormy day now spoke with grounded clarity. When her church asked her to give a short talk during their community gathering, she didn't hesitate. She shared her story, not the dramatic details, but the quiet truths. That healing isn't loud. That courage isn't always leaping. It's sometimes just showing up. That it's never too late to rewrite the story you're living. The room went silent when she said, "The life I thought was ending was only just beginning." Afterward, people lined up to thank her. One man in his 80s whispered, "I think I've been asleep. Maybe it's time I wake up too." Charlotte smiled, took his hand, and said, "There's still time. There's always time, as long as you're still breathing." She had grown. Not by changing who she was, but by remembering who she had always been. A woman of strength, of grace, of boundless depth. And now, at nearly 70, she stood taller than ever, not just for herself, but for everyone watching quietly, hoping they could bloom too. It was early autumn when Charlotte stood once more on the bluff overlooking the ocean. The wind had softened, the sky a watercolor of oranges and violets. Leaves swirled at her feet, and the air carried the scent of sea salt and possibility. She closed her eyes, letting the moment wrap around her like a warm shawl. A year ago, she would have been inside, watching the world go by from her window, wondering where her life had gone. But now, she felt as if she had come home, to herself. Charlotte didn't have millions of followers. She didn't go viral or start a movement. But what she did do was far more meaningful. She reclaimed the life she still had, and in doing so, became a quiet revolution in the hearts of others. She had learned that freedom isn't something we stumble into. It's something we choose. Every day, she chose to let go of resentment. She chose to stop apologizing for aging. She chose love over pride, action over regret, presence over nostalgia. And most importantly, she chose herself. At her 69th birthday celebration, her family and a few friends gathered in the garden behind her cottage. There were fairy lights strung in the trees, mismatched chairs, and mason jars filled with wildflowers. Her grandson surprised her by reading one of her poems, his voice shaking with emotion. "You taught me that seasons aren't endings, but quiet invitations to begin again." Tears streamed down her face. Her daughter pulled her aside afterward and whispered, "You've changed, Mom. You're lighter, braver, happier." Charlotte smiled, brushing a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Finally stopped waiting," she said, "and I started living." That night, after everyone had gone, Charlotte sat alone under the stars. She thought about all the women out there, sitting in their living rooms, standing in their kitchens, staring into mirrors, wondering if they were too old, too tired, too late. And so, she made one last vow, not in a journal, not whispered into the sea, but boldly spoken to the night sky. "If I still have breath, I still have purpose. If I still have time, I still have dreams. And if someone is still listening, I'll keep telling my story. Because that's what we all deserve. Not just a life of survival, but a life that sings, even softly. A life that dares to bloom, no matter the season." Charlotte didn't find magic in some faraway place. She found it exactly where she was, inside herself. And now, her only mission was this: to help others find it, too. The greatest lesson Charlotte discovered was simple, yet profound: it's never too late to live fully. We spend so much of our lives waiting for the right moment, for permission, for someone else to believe in us. But Charlotte realized that the only permission she ever needed was her own. By letting go of regrets, embracing her uniqueness, and stepping into each day with curiosity rather than fear, she transformed her life. Not by changing everything, but by changing how she saw everything. Even in her late 60s, Charlotte learned to love herself in a deeper, truer way. She found joy not in grand achievements, but in quiet moments of courage. Speaking her truth, creating again, letting go of old pain. Her story is a reminder that growth doesn't stop at a certain age. Only fear does. And when we let go of that fear, we unlock the freedom to be exactly who we were always meant to be.